All right, thank you so much, Joe, and the Center for Practice Transformation, and to everyone who's joining us today. It's an honor to share this work that we've been doing the last few years, using the model of recovery from white conditioning to build anti-racist practice and community. And so I want to begin by acknowledging that as I sit here today, I am on traditional Dakota land, and acknowledging that is one step to show respect, to affirm Indigenous sovereignty, and to stop the erasure of Indigenous people, history, and culture as we move toward more fully honoring the truth, which is so much the hope and commitment of this model. I also want to lift up and acknowledge George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and all of the other lives stolen from families and communities and our world due to police brutality and state-sanctioned violence. Alongside also an acknowledgement and lifting up of the Black Lives Matter movement and other community efforts and uprisings to call us forward on a path of transformation. And so a few more acknowledgements I think are helpful for setting the context of the content we'll be reviewing today. So to begin, I want to express my deepest gratitude to the BIPOC mentors in my life who have nurtured and challenged me and who served as consultants in this model's development. I also want to reaffirm the goal of the webinar series, the deconstructing and decentralizing whiteness. And I also want to hold that alongside the tension that in this model, we are in fact centering whiteness, but we are centering it differently to expose it, to study its patterns, and to transform its violent legacies. And so I want to be clear that when I say we, our, and us today, I'm speaking specifically to my fellow white people and to our BIPOC brothers, sisters, and siblings with us here today. My hope is that this model serves as one tool and resource that can be offered to direct white people to go do our work, to, as Resmaa Menakem says, go get our cousins. I also think it's important to name that recovery likely means something different to all of us. I'm sure we've had varying experiences, some of them hopeful and some of them more difficult. Some of us may love 12-step programs with all of their strengths and their shortcomings. Some of us may prefer harm reduction approaches or other healing or professional care options. And so I say that and want to really emphasize this next slide, that this model represents a sliver of the broad and deep work necessary for collective liberation. It's one tool amid many, many tools. And like my mentor, Dr. Juan Carlos Arauz, reminds me, organizing must occur at various levels, including intrapersonal, so really looking within, having the discipline to self-reflect and discern and act from a more informed place. Engagement, getting out of ourselves and connected and seeking knowledge and investing in that learning and action, ultimately to support institutional and systemic change as well. And so I've bolded the word intrapersonal, again, to just acknowledge that that's the level that this model primarily lives at, in the spirit of what Dr. Ken Hardy says, that we must work to see and be different so that we can do different. And so keeping all of that in mind, I want to extend this invitation to you today, to all of us, in the spirit of this Leonard Cohen lyric, there is a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. My hope is that during our time together, we can allow ourselves to crack open, shine a light around, see what resonates, aligns, see where the tension lives. And again, like Joe said, we'll have time for some Q&A and dialogue at the end. So just as a quick preview of what we have in store, we're starting by gathering together. We'll establish some agreements and working definitions. We'll then really center ourselves on listening to wisdom from BIPOC voices who for decades, for centuries, have been asking us as white people to face ourselves and to pursue transformation and change. We'll then proceed with an overview of the actual 12 steps and share out some of the things we've been learning as we've implemented groups both locally here in Minnesota and also across the country. And so I want to offer these agreements of how we be in this space together with a recognition that being in a Zoom webinar feels really different than being live with all of you in a space, feeling connected as a community. But nevertheless, I think they're helpful resources for today and maybe for the future as well. So to begin, I won't read all of them, but Vanessa Jackson is a clinical social worker and soul doula based out of Georgia. And she says, "Speak your truth, but hold my heart while you do it." Glenn Singleton, in his work for Courageous Conversations, encourages us to stay engaged, expect and accept non-closure. And so with these agreements in mind, I want to pose a question to you. And again, because of our Zoom limitations, I'm going to ask you to just self-reflect and sort of hold that answer with yourself. But my question to you is, what comes to mind at like a very sort of instant level when you hear the term white supremacy? And so often when I present this work to audiences, people respond instantly. They're thinking about images that I'm about to show, which again, I want to name as activating images. People shout out the KKK. I think of neo-Nazis, tiki torches, some of these really overt symbols of white supremacy. And then my second question to audiences is regarding this next slide and the placement of my image here as one of the faces of white supremacy. And so a question that I would also invite you to self-reflect on is, why would I, as someone who holds values of social justice and a commitment to dismantle racism, why would I ever want to place my picture here as connected to this violent ideology of white supremacy? So often the responses, and again, forgive me because I can't necessarily see all the chat responses if there are any, but I would offer that people generally say things like, because you have white privilege, because you walk in the world with unearned advantage. Other folks talk about because it's systemic and you're a part of the system. And so in that spirit, I want to offer these working definitions of white supremacy before also going back to that previous slide. So per the School of the Americas Watch, we can think of white supremacy as a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white people for the purpose of maintaining a system of wealth, power, and privilege. And the Dismantling Racism organization offers us this other important message, that white supremacy is ever present in our institutional and cultural assumptions that assign value, morality, goodness, and humanity to the white group, while casting people and communities of color as worthless, immoral, bad, inhuman, and undeserving. In other words, we often think about this as the centering of whiteness as just normal, right, and good.
Christina, there are so many great comments here in the chat box. Because we benefit from it, all white folks benefit from white supremacy. We operate in a culture that upholds white dominant thinking. It's offensive. We all have the face. Sorry, I just wanted to share those with you as you're going.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. And thank you for everyone again who's engaging with the material. So a few other reasons that I also want to lift up regarding my connection here, my picture here. The first is a confession of sorts. That years ago, as I began to deepen my understandings of racism and anti-racism, when BIPOC activists would use the term white supremacy to talk about the systems that needed to change and the work that white people needed to do, my instinct was to recoil. It felt like too hard or too raw of a word, and I didn't like it. And I ultimately realized that that is my ego. That is me getting in the way of actually showing up and listening and hearing and being in solidarity. So stepping into that tension and accepting my connection to white supremacy has been a freedom of sorts to show up in better alignment with my values and do the work for the rest of my life. Second, I also want to name Dr. Joseph White and his, who was considered the father of Black psychology and who gifted us this powerful framework regarding psychological strengths of African Americans, one of which includes a healthy suspicion of white people. And so again, a healthy suspicion of white people is this brilliant adaptation for navigating violent legacies of whiteness in this country and our world. And so when I connect myself to that, then I am reminded that people of color see me and don't know if I'm going to be the next white person who calls the police because a Black woman is sleeping in her dorm room, or who calls the police because people of color are barbecuing in the park. So again, connecting myself to that is a part of committing to respecting the ways that people have navigated to survive us. Lastly, I also want to just say, as Dr. Robin DiAngelo calls this binary thinking, one of the most effective adaptations of racism, convincing us that we are either good people and not racist, or bad people and racist, which means that we then can't have conversations about how good people are complicit in and perpetuate systemic racism and white supremacy. And so again, putting my picture here is part of breaking up that binary thinking and really asserting that all of us as white folks are implicated, we are complicit, we all have work to do, and no one is exempt, no matter our age, gender, political party, years in the field, etc. And so in our recovery frame, we're thinking of this as a spectrum of recovery, knowing that, again, all white people are here. Some days we are more courageous on the right side there, living out a commitment to act as an accomplice in dismantling systemic racism and white supremacy, and other days regressing on the journey toward, on the left, more overt white supremacy. And truly, day by day, moment to moment, our actions, again, determine where we're positioned on this spectrum. But we're here, we have work to do, and recovery says that we get to do that for the rest of our lives in a disciplined way, held in community. And so this notion of linking recovery to anti-racism work really emerged out of a 2014 video clip involving Ta-Nehisi Coates, which I look forward to showing you in just a moment. But I also want to go back a few steps in just sharing my own personal journey as a clinical social worker, graduating in 2008 with my master's in social work. And while I learned a tremendous amount, there were also significant limitations in my training, specifically related to the way our diversity class was approached, in a sort of, let's learn about this cultural group one day and this other cultural group the next week, as if culture and diversity exist outside of me, without ever really being asked or challenged to cultivate skills and a lifelong discipline to self-studying and self-interrogating whiteness and how that would show up in my life and in the relationships I was building in my work. And so then, as I became an in-home family therapist, I quickly began having dreams of an alternate universe. I was working primarily with African American and Latina mothers, and in my dreams, these women would serve as my therapist, coaching me in regards to my whiteness. So for example, saying things like, wow, Christina, I noticed that condescension in your tone, and I wonder how that's connected to whiteness and white supremacy, and I'd like you to go and journal about that and bring your reflections to our session next week. Let's look at that. Over the years that followed, I was blessed to attend some really enriching conferences and trainings and to continue to grow some of those skills, but I was still longing for something that brought it all together. And for me, that alignment really came into play when I saw this video. So I'm gonna follow Joe's instructions and try to share it with you now.
Thing is that we talk about race a lot. We do, so I think it's like wrong to say, well, we don't have conversations. No, we actually talk about it quite a bit. I don't think we talk about it in depth as much as we should. And I think part of the problem is when you start talking about it in depth, when you start getting to a level where you say, listen, everything we are, everything we have isn't, is built on past sins. The things are tied. The things are tied. When you start recognizing that there's something congenital, it's as if, I had a problem with alcohol, and I could say, okay, but I'm just going to go into the bar and I'm not going to have a drink. I'm going to be okay. I don't need to, have any sort of conversation. That's a different conversation than that I have to confess to the fact that I'm an alcoholic. There's something in me, that's here, and I will always have to cope with that, and I will always have to deal with that. The honesty that takes, the strength that takes, the courage that takes is pretty profound.
Okay. I think we're back. And so the moment I heard that video clip, I sat down at my computer and wrote out the first draft of this 12-step model of recovery from white conditioning. For me, this idea there's something in us that will always be there, we'll always have to cope with that, was just really helpful, again, in ensuring I stay connected to the work versus running from it. In the years that followed, in 2015, 16, and 17, I was seeking consultation, again, from BIPOC mentors and sharing out the model conceptually at a few local conferences. Vanessa Jackson ultimately, in conversation, said to me, look, I feel your heart. I had an idea, I wrote a book. Go read a book. And really receiving her love and encouragement, we sent our sons up to my parents' house for the weekend, and I wrote what I consider to be a 72-page love letter to my people in the spirit of we must love ourselves enough to face ourselves and to pursue and commit to transformation and change. And so that text now serves as like an anchor in our weekly recovery group meetings. I want to also just name that while this model was being developed, simultaneously Minnesota was continuing to be ranked as one of the worst states in the nation for racial disparity. This study lifts up that we were second worst in the nation in terms of quality of life indicators between white and Black Minnesotans. So in this in the need to do something, right, to show up and to keep pushing ourselves and fighting against all of these injustices, we finally launched a group. January 2018, our first group started, and we've been meeting every week for the last 2.5 years, also launching other groups, and we'll talk about that a little later on. So this slide, again, for me is my sort of origin story of how I've come to sit here with you today. But more importantly, I want to again shift and center the BIPOC voices who, as I said before, for centuries have been asking us to look within and to transform ourselves and our community. I want to begin by lifting up language from Bell Hooks, who describes imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy as the power structure underlying the social order. And I want to lift this up as this broad frame, affirming that our movements for justice and liberation must be intersectional. And I say that alongside the tension that today, as Dr. Ken Hardy asserts, it is sometimes necessary to focus singularly on race. And that is what we'll be doing today. One example of why that is important and necessary is myself as a white woman. In conversations about race and racism, it can be very common to center my gender oppression and to use some escapist tactics and maneuvers to avoid facing the ways in which I am on the perpetrating side of harm when it comes to matters of race. And so as we proceed thinking about whiteness, white supremacy, I'm going to offer us some language that can help us form a diagnosis of sorts. And while I'm not clinically diagnosing anyone, I do think diagnosing can be helpful to give us language about the challenges we're facing and about the plan forward for treatment and for transformation. And so Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was quoted as saying the nation is sick, was also quoted often as talking about the soul sickness of white America. And soul sickness for me is a helpful frame regarding what I want to combat every day. James Baldwin said, I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. I base this on their conduct, not on what they say, and this means that they have become in themselves moral monsters. Death of the heart, for me, again, is another diagnosis that I hold close. And when I wake up in the morning, my question then becomes, how am I going to ensure that my heart is alive in the fight for justice? Maya Angelou also talked about the plague of racism is insidious, entering into minds and finding lifelong purchase in bloodstream. And as a quick aside, I would also acknowledge that Albert Einstein in 1946 said that the separation of the races is not a disease of colored people, but a disease of white people. I do not intend to be quiet about it. Thinking of these terms, a soul sickness, the plague of racism, the death of the heart in our country, charting a path forward of transformation and change, to me includes this wisdom from Tony K. Bambara, who said, revolution begins with the self in the self. We'd better take the time to fashion revolutionary selves, revolutionary lives, revolutionary relationships. Because, as Paulo Freire said, no one can be authentically human while preventing others from being so. And this wisdom from Paulo Freire is reflected in what we have as sort of the closest thing to a slogan. And it's on our business cards here. It says, recovery from white conditioning, reclaim your full humanity. So this idea that there's something in us and that we have to work to, again, show up in the world in solidarity and fight for justice to be fully human. The next slide, I think, is really important and really summarizes so much of what I've shared so far. I want to give a quick backstory as to how it came into my life. One of our recovery group members told the story of having tried to explain this recovery group to an American Indian man in her life. And she said, gosh, I was just struggling to find the words. We're like white people working on our like souls. And he said, oh, no, I get it. It's a group for white people to save themselves from themselves. And he proceeded to pull out this prayer and share with her, which I'll read with you now. Prayer for the white man. And now, grandfather, I ask you to bless the white man. He needs your wisdom, your guidance. You see, for so long he has tried to destroy my people and only feels comfortable when given power. Bless them, show them the peace we understand, teach them humility. For I fear they will someday destroy themselves and their children, as they have done so Mother Earth. I plead, I cry. After all, they are my brothers. And so these slides are really in so many ways are worthy of an 8-hour training in and of themselves. But my hope is that we are conveying, again, this sort of spiritual element to the work of transforming ourselves and our community. And so we've now arrived at the moment where we're going to go ahead and share out with all of you what the 12 steps of recovery from white conditioning actually look like. We want to, again, always say that it's a derivative work based on the 12 steps of AA. And we did work with retain an intellectual property attorney to ensure that we didn't infringe on their copyright. So drawing from SAMHSA and broad recovery efforts happening around the globe, I want to just include this slide and reinforce that recovery emerges from hope, is person-driven, occurs via many pathways, is holistic, etc. And so again, we're holding this container of recovery for lifelong introspection while being held in loving, accountable community. I also want to just give a quick shout out to some of our core group members who are on this call today and whose voices you will have the pleasure of hearing, who've been working these steps for the last 2.5 years. So here we go, step 1.
Step 1. We admitted that we had been socially conditioned by the ideology of white supremacy, that our minds were subject to racial biases, often unconsciously so. The first step to any kind of recovery is admitting that we have a problem. Individuals not ready to acknowledge a problem may be unable to pursue and receive the help they need. Becoming aware of a problem and admitting it to others can be challenging, but it is a fundamental step on the recovery journey.
Okay, so we have another video to share to really echo the sentiment and the purpose of the first step. I'll go ahead and I would ask that if folks want to gather their thoughts and reflections and observations, you are more than welcome to drop them in the chat. And then Joe, maybe if you want to help me navigate reading them, that would be great as soon as we finish the video.
So show me the smart child. Okay, why is she the smart child?
Because she looks like me.
Okay. Show me the mean child. Okay, why is she the mean child?
Because she's way darker.
Okay. Show me the good child. Why is she the good child?
Because I think she looks like me.
Okay. Show me the bad child. Why is she the bad child?
Because she's a lot darker.
Show me the ugly child. Why is she the ugly child?
Because she's like a lot darker.
What do you think? Shocking to you?
I just think it's because she's not exposed. I mean,
You're almost near tears. Why? It's not meant to upset you. What's upsetting you?
it's not really upsetting. I mean, everything she said, she chose someone like her because she's smart, and she is.
All the good attributes. She's got a healthy ego. That looks like me. That kid's like me.
And as far as the one she chose for, being ugly or mean, I mean, you can't even see any facial features in that one. But she has never asked about any, color.
Okay, so having watched that video, I'm curious if folks, have observations, and I'm going to try to check out the chat here as well.
Heartbreaking, tears, education starts in the home. Wow. Shows how deeply ingrained racism is. We see ourselves in our children. We don't hear the mom owning what she needs to talk to her daughter about and teach her. Thank you, Kayla. Conditioning. Can't even admit she's sad. Are you following these at all, Christina?
Yes,
Okay,
I can see them. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, wow. So thank you all for this rich feedback that is, again, zooming across my screen. Let's see. Well, what I want to, again, thank you for noticing and observing. And something that I think folks talked about, it should be upsetting that we have to feel. And I want to, again, hold the tension that white women's tears have historically been and contemporarily are violent and can be really used in violent ways. And we have to feel like, as white-bodied folks, we have to get out of our heads and into our hearts and allow ourselves to feel the grief and the heartache and the rage of what is happening. And so for me, every time I watch it, I notice how she goes to a place of vulnerability and to feel and to allow herself to cry, and then really quickly buttons that back up into a space of rationalizing, defending, excusing, And so for me, that echoes also of what Dr. Ken Hardy says, that the farthest distance for white people to travel is often from our heads to our hearts. Also, like other folks said, I saw a few more comments about, yeah, just the privilege of not teaching your children about racism. We have to do better. I'll look forward to reading them all later. But the point is, yes, from a very early age, this little child, nobody explicitly sat her down and taught her this is the good child and the bad child, but she had already internalized that message. And that's step one, it's in us. We have been socially conditioned, it's in us, it will always be here, we'll always have to work against that in this journey of transformation. And so I want to also share this next slide from Sonia Renee Taylor, who says, as a Black woman to us white folks, you are struggling in this system as well. It is killing you too. Whiteness is not about you. Whiteness is the structure into which you were born. Stop experiencing the conversation of whiteness and white supremacist delusion as who you are, and start experiencing it as something that you were assigned that is not serving you, that you wish to remove elements of it from your life on a regular basis. So step one, it's in us, and we're going to do the work forward. And that brings us then to step two. Oh, oops, hold on. Okay. Step two, we came to believe that we could, oh, there's the sound. Here we go.
Step two, we came to believe that we could embrace our ignorance as an invitation to learn. We acknowledge that we, as white people, will never know what it feels like to walk in the world as a person of color. We embrace our not knowing as a powerful reminder of our ongoing need for new learning, and we abandon white supremacist traditions of knowing how others should feel, think, and act.
Yes, so this starting place of ignorance and this lifelong invitation for learning in some ways can serve as the spiritual foundation of our work. And when we're together in spaces, I always ask audiences to raise their hand in response to this question. How many of you have people in your network who say things like, I just don't understand why Black Lives Matter has to protest on the highway? And generally everyone raises their hands 99% of the time. And so when statements like that are made in a spirit of condescension and judgment, there's generally not an openness to new learning. I just don't understand why they do it, right? That's not a sincere seeking. If, however, a white person says, gosh, like, I don't have lived experience that informs me of a risk so great that I would put my body on the line and I would take that risk and get out on the highway. And so I have so much I need to learn. I wonder where I can go and seek that knowledge. The root is the same, the ignorance, the things that we don't know. Everyone gathers awareness throughout our lives, but if we commit to it in this, again, the spiritual foundation way, we can invest in that lifelong journey of learning. Step three.
Step 3, we developed support systems to keep us engaged in this work. We are aware that facing and recovering from the effects of white supremacist conditioning will involve difficult, sometimes painful moments. We will commit to developing practices that facilitate self-care to ensure that we are gentle with ourselves while also bravely able to confront the dehumanizing ideology of white supremacy.
Yes, so step three, the first 3 steps are really, again, about building a strong foundation. And as I've underlined here, to keep us engaged in this work. Far too often people rush in, make a mistake, and then turn away. And our commitment is to build support systems and practices that keep us coming back to our core humanity and then showing up in a spirit of accountability and solidarity forward. And so in that spirit, we've included this quote, be gentle with yourself. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. Step 4. Sorry, struggling here a little.
Step 4. We journeyed boldly inward, exploring and acknowledging ways in which white supremacist teachings have been integrated into our minds and spirits. After acknowledging the problem, we must also acknowledge that it has impacted many areas of our lives, consciously and unconsciously. Each of us must explore ways, past and present, in which the ideology of white supremacy has negatively impacted us, our understanding of history, our social networks, and our patterns of interacting with people of color, with an emphasized focus on microaggressions.
And so step 4, a parallel to AA's searching and fearless moral inventory. Again, we're going to take a really deep dive, shine that light around, and study these patterns. So this is a sample step 4 worksheet, which again, all the PowerPoint slides will be sent to you after. So check it out. Also, I would offer my faith that many of you are aware of the term and definitions regarding microaggressions. If not, I think this is important to review in greater depth. But I included it also with micro in parentheses to honor something that Vanessa Jackson says, that I am just done calling them micro because they hurt. So I would also invite us as white folks to think about these as aggressions, insults, invalidations, assaults.
Step 5, we confessed our mistakes and failings to ourselves and others. Beyond identifying ways in which our thinking, feeling, and relating have been impacted by white supremacist conditioning, honestly addressing the actions that have emerged from that conditioning is a separate, necessary step. Confessing past and ongoing microaggressions to a group and receiving support is an essential part of recovery.
Yeah, so if we, again, embrace this idea that this is not work for spectators, right? That we have to roll up our sleeves and have skin in the game. We know that we are going to make mistakes. And so step 5 is about coming back and sharing that and learning the lessons and sharing them with others in a spirit of confess you were wrong yesterday, it will show you are wise today.
Step 6. We were entirely ready to deconstruct previous ways of knowing as they had been developed through the lens of white supremacy. After admitting these problems, white supremacist conditioning and related actions, it is then time to let go of knowledge developed in isolation from people of color.
And so a little matrix for you. What if I told you it's okay to change your opinion based on new information? Step 6 is really about just acknowledging and sitting with that and getting ready to deconstruct whiteness, as again the webinar series calls us to do.
Step 7. We humbly explored new ways of understanding, proactively seeking out new learning and reconstructing a more inclusive sense of reality. This step involves mindfully and intentionally engaging in learning to more deeply understand the experience of people of color in a society organized around white supremacy. This type of learning can take place in a variety of ways, including reading texts written by people of color, actively listening to the experiences of people of color, patronizing businesses owned by people of color, etc.
So again, step 6 is about deconstructing, letting go of knowledge developed in isolation from people of color. And step 7 is about rebuilding our understandings of the world, our cognitive schemas. And so I would offer this as like the tiniest list of resources and options that we could seek out in terms of authors and businesses. And again, just this practice of authentic, empathic listening, as opposed to, again, that defensive reaction and the turning away from people's pain.
Step 8. We committed ourselves to ongoing study of our racial biases, conscious or unconscious, and our maladaptive patterns of white supremacist thinking. This step is about identifying our triggers to negative thoughts or other stereotypes, positive or negative, about people of color. We remain curious about the source of our thoughts, fears, and assumptions, and perpetually aware of their existence.
Yes, so step 8, one of our members calls this just a slimy step, that we're really gonna continue to look at ourselves and see the things that, in spite of all of our efforts to change, continue to come up for us. And that slime is, I think, necessary in the spirit of what James Baldwin says. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so in this commitment to sort of systematically face and track some of our reactions, I would offer that much like we support someone battling depression and tracking their automatic negative thoughts, we can have that same level of discipline to really noticing what situations activate some of those stereotype thinkings in our minds or those racial biases, and then pay attention to the distress or just that the way that it feels in our body as we're again studying what keeps coming up for us.
Step 9. We develop strategies to counteract our racial biases. Developing positive associations to counter negative thoughts is an important proactive strategy in recovery from white conditioning. We believe that a powerful way to develop positive associations is through authentic relationships with people of color. In lieu of such relationships, we can still engage in daily proactive practices to retrain our brain from the ill effects of white supremacist conditioning.
And so in the example of, again, working with someone battling depression and studying those automatic negative thoughts, we know that we also want to increase the positive self-talk, the neural networks that are going to remind us to not listen to those negative voices. And so I've included here just this slide really celebrating neuroplasticity, right? I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. I can do this work, I can chart new pathways and create new neural networks. One of our members talks about whenever she's driving and sees people of color on the sidewalk, without disrupting them in any way, she says aloud to herself, windows rolled up in her own vehicle, hello, my brother, hello, my sister, hello, my sibling. Hello, my brother, hello, my sister, hello, my sibling. The sense that I have to retrain my brain to see folks as connected in this shared humanity. Step 10.
Step 10, we embrace the responsibility of focusing on our impact more than our intentions and interactions with people of color. Taking responsibility for the impact of our actions is an ongoing part of recovery. If we fall back into perpetuating white supremacist ideology or defending actions that have caused hurt to people of color, it is important to stop and admit it. Prioritizing impact instead of explaining the intent of our behavior, i.e., I didn't mean to offend you, is essential for attending to the human being in front of us.
Yeah. So intent and impact. I'm sure, again, many of you have heard this and thought of this, but truly, if we, as humans, we will do harm. I think that's a really important and painful thing to acknowledge, right? Even with my children, whom I love so much. I make mistakes, I do harm. And when that happens, I have a choice to either just like, oh, no, explain, no, you misunderstand me. I didn't mean it that way. Or I can really go to them in love and sit in a place of acknowledging the harm and listening and understanding and work to do the repair. And so we've included here just a quick snapshot from Dr. Ken Hardy and his privilege and subjugated task model, with this notion that really intentions, as he calls it, are the province of the privileged. That's where we want to live. We want to sit and just really clarify that we didn't mean it and someone else misunderstood, while our BIPOC siblings are living with the impact and the consequences. So step 10 is saying we are going to change that pattern. We're going to prioritize impact.
Step 11, we engaged in daily practices of self-reflection. Reflecting on the day, on moments in which we confronted our own white supremacist conditioning, and on moments in which we were still bound by its limiting beliefs, is an investment in our recovery. Relevant spiritual practices may play a helpful role in this step, as a way to encourage us towards continued growth and connection beyond our mistakes.
Yes. So again, this is a lifelong journey, committing to really take stock of a day's worth of growing. It's just reflected in this image here, but forever and always for the rest of our lives, we can notice and then study where our growing edges are and how we're going to be more courageous the next day.
Step 12. We committed ourselves to sharing this message with our white brothers, sisters, and siblings in order to build a supportive recovery community and to encourage personal accountability within our culture every day. Assisting others to seek help in recovery from white supremacist conditioning and in becoming an ally with people of color is a core component of recovery. Working with future recovery from white conditioning groups is a common choice for this step.
And so this next slide is from Audre Lorde, who says, when people of color are expected to educate white people as to their humanity, the oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. And so this step to me is really important. And this quote, I think, again, reflects the tension that white people need to absolutely seek out and pay for the emotional and intellectual labor of BIPOC folks who are offering us perspectives and guidance on dismantling racism and the actions we need to take 100%. And at the same time, we have access to white people in many spaces, in many ways, and we can, in fact, talk to them about race and racism, and we can cultivate those skills and that commitment to invite people in who are willing to learn and listen. We can go and commit, as Resmaa Menakem also says, go build healthy white anti-racist community. Like, what does that look like? Who are your heroes? What are your songs, traditions, rituals, rules of admonishment? Step 12 is about saying we have to go and get our people and work on our communal transformation. So those are the 12 steps. And I'm noticing that some folks are raising their hands, but so I want to acknowledge that I just saw that. And also we're getting closer to the Q&A portion. So I hope that you can send your questions to Joe, who's really strategically gathering them for us when we have just time to focus and dialogue. And so for anyone who's curious about how these 12 steps come to life in our current meeting structure, I wanted to just share the quick outline of how a meeting operates. We begin by repeating together the call to recovery, which is from a Kenyan author, Shailja Patel, who blessed us in using it. And so we say aloud, we are here to be fully human to ourselves, fully accountable to each other, and to each other meaning our brothers, sisters, siblings of color in this global family way. We then proceed with a welcome statement and introduction, announcements of any upcoming actions or trainings that folks should know about, along with passing the calendar because we have a rotating facilitator shared leadership style. We then host a minute of silence to center our hearts and minds on the lived experiences of our brothers, sisters, siblings of color, and Indigenous people, along with a quick reading about a white anti-racist who's gone before us as motivation to take real risk and fight for social change. We then proceed together with reading aloud the 12 steps and then turn to the chapter of the day, focusing on a particular step, reading through that chapter, and then having time for uninterrupted turns for each member to speak or pass. And an uninterrupted turn just means that we share what we are thinking about, what resonated with us, what we're struggling with, striving for, any actions we want to be accountable to taking as part of using that group to motivate us for change. We then read the closing statement and repeat the call to recovery and engage in back and forth dialogue after the meeting. So beyond our Twin Cities core group that, as I mentioned, has been meeting for the last 2.5 years as just a community-based group, anyone can join, who's again committed to building this white anti-racist practice and community. We also have partnered with local organizations to host agency-based recovery groups. Often there will be a BIPOC caucus space, an affinity group space, while then white-bodied staff are doing a round of the 12 steps together. And so that has happened in mental health settings, schools, places of worship. We also have a few local corrections staff who have said, you know what, we want to just informally spend our lunch hour getting together and to really work on looking at ourselves and self-studying so that we can transform our practice. I would also just offer that the structure can be really flexible. So as I mentioned, some groups do 12 weeks, one and done, others once a month. You know, it really can look a lot of different ways, and often folks attend a couple times and then go and launch their own groups because the model is so structured and relatively easy to replicate. Again, in that spirit of just reaching more white folks and bringing people in to engage in this lifelong work. I imagine that for some of you, you're sitting here wondering, well, like, so what is changing, right? What are some individual actions that are emerging? What are you noticing? And what I want to say is that really one of the most common things that I hear in our group meetings is the sense of, I'm saying this because I want to be accountable to doing something about it. So I'm saying this because I need to go back to this person and repair this harm. Or I'm saying this because I do need to send this email to this organization and follow up about that problematic thing that happened. And so we're using each other and the relationships that we're building to really hold each other in a space of love and accountability for change. A few quick examples, as I know we're drawing down on time and close to our Q&A portion. In regards to the fourth step, one of our members who works in the criminal justice system in close proximity to judges and making sentencing recommendations, in a fourth step meeting, he said, you know, the more that I keep coming here, the more that I study and recognize my biases and my limited ways of understanding, I am having different conversations, more courageous conversations with the judges that I work with, and I am making different sentencing recommendations. And so again, this journey inward to really face and study ourselves with a commitment to do differently in the world. An example of a seventh step impact when we're thinking about building a more inclusive sense of reality, seeking out new perspectives. One of our members shared that as she began to really recognize the powerful cultural expertise displayed by her African-American colleagues while working with African-American clients, she partnered with some staff and the HR department to say that there should be a cultural expertise salary bump, really comparable in many ways to the bilingual pay differential afforded other folks, including those of us who just learned the technical aspects of a language. And so that organization now does pay a salary increase for cultural expertise. In regards to the 12th step, one of our members talks about just the value of thinking about shifting some of her previous responses toward white people on their journey of learning. Previously, there might have been more arrogance about like, dude, you're racist, it's terrible, don't you know better? But as she thinks of herself more in a sponsorship, like AA has sponsors, thinking of herself in that way, her whole sort of approach has shifted to say really humbly and with love, gosh, sometimes I used to feel that way too. I'm learning a whole lot of other things, and I'd love to go out for coffee if you'd like to go and talk about it. So again, just shifting how we're going to try to be effective in reaching more white folks. So those are 3 examples, again, in this limited time we have, but my hope is that at minimum, we are shifting also the paradigm from thinking about white social workers like myself as just like nice helper people, but really, really looking at like the soul sickness and death of the heart that lives in me that I have to work to combat and to be healthy and courageous in order to work in solidarity with BIPOC communities. That there's something in me that it will always be there, that I'll always have to work on that. And then second, I would also add that we're hoping to sync up with some restorative justice networks. We did have a member come through the process at the encouragement of his lawyer after an incident in which he did race-based harm. And so again, this is about transformation and connecting all of us as white people. None of us are exempt for really, to really come together and do the work. And so, let's see. Oh, just quickly, I do want to say, and then I'll go back to that slide, that our website is recoveryfromwhiteconditioning.com. All of our materials are available and downloadable for free there. Any proceeds from book sales for people who prefer to have like an actual book to hold in their hands, or any speaking engagements, all of those proceeds go directly to BIPOC-led organizations fighting for racial justice. We're very committed to that. And any dialogue beyond our time today, questions, or if you have a desire to attend a meeting, you're welcome to contact us through our website. We have a Zoom meeting that happens based here locally Wednesdays from 6 to 7. There's also Bay Area and New Haven chapters that have Zoom meetings alongside, again, just other folks around the country who've gathered themselves to work the steps. And so again, this last slide I want to share before we hold space for Q&A, I think really just summarizes so much of what I hope to have conveyed today from Dwayne Reed, this idea that white supremacy won't die until white people see it as a white issue they need to solve, rather than a Black issue they need to empathize with. And so thank you all again for being here and taking all of that in and coming on this journey with us. I'm really open to hearing, Joe, the questions that have been shared. Again, those places of alignment or the curiosities or any critical feedback as well, because we are on this lifelong journey of transformation and change.
Well, thank you, Christina. We've had such a rich and raw and robust chat going on this entire time. I hope everyone has been able to catch up on it, and with so many questions, we'll just get into it here. I'm going to dovetail a few together here for you. In regard to the 12-step, there were a few questions. Is there no crosstalk rules such as in AA and other 12-step meetings? Is anyone allowed to form a group or a meeting? And how do you proceed to access or create that in your community?
Yeah.
And are all the group members all white?
Yes, great question. Okay, so lots of rich layers there. What I will say, I'll try to go in order. Number one, yes, we don't have crosstalk. That happens after the meeting. And I think this idea of really just holding what you're sitting with is something that we often don't do as white people. So holding like this time for ourselves and others too on their learning journey, with certainly an opportunity to pull people aside after, is how we've approached the meeting. Second, in terms of can anyone launch, I think start their own group? Absolutely, all of our materials are downloadable. We do strongly recommend that folks come and like see, feel, experience, connect, practice with us 1 or 2 times, but truly the hope is that this is able to be shared and community is able to be built. And specifically to that point, so far our groups are really centered on calling white people in to accept our responsibility for that transformation and to alleviate the burden of asking BIPOC folks to undo racism when we are the benefactors of unearned advantage and they are surviving it daily. I will say that one of the organizations where we launched a white-bodied group alongside a BIPOC group, the BIPOC staff had expressed a desire to read along, separately from the white group, but to read along with the text. I think, and rightfully so, in a space of like, what the hell are they doing over there? What are they learning? And also just to explore the ways that white supremacy conditioning has likely impacted all of us, right? It's this toxic soup that we're swimming in, and it's in everything. So there was also an expressed desire to look at that. But that group really concluded that a different sort of healing pathway would feel better and more aligned to meet their unique needs. And I would offer to that, like Dr. Brianna French, Local Radical Healing for Communities of Color. There's some really beautiful work that I think, again, says that the work we need to do for collective liberation, that there's separate ways in which we heal, accountability being a greater focus for white folks, and healing and liberation for our BIPOC siblings, again, with this shared vision of we can only be human together, this shared vision of coming back to each other as well.
Thank you, Christina. I want to go back because we had so many questions and comments. It was such a powerful video. Do you happen to know, did they do the same test with a child of color? And do you happen to know what those results were? I know there was a lot of furious comments, a lot of sharing going on at that time. Could you comment on that, Christina?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, the original doll test that was used to overturn Brown versus Board of Education, where we were acknowledging that separate but equal is inherently unequal, and that it was hurting Black children who were seeing themselves as inferior. That's decades old and also tragically reproduced at similar rates now. A Girl Like Me is a great documentary by Curie Davis, produced about 10 years ago, I think, where again, her results showed a really similar process where the white children are identified as, or the white doll is identified as the good doll, and the Black doll to the Black child is identified as the bad or ugly doll. And again, in the video, I think it's particularly worth watching and painful to watch this little Black child experience the cognitive dissonance of knowing that she's a good person, but knowing that the Black doll looks like her, and that all of those messages have been tied to that doll. So absolutely, those videos exist, and I think that should be watched, and we need to, again, grieve and feel and sit with the weight of that. And then my commitment also in showing the video today in regards to this white child is sort of reflective of what Dr. Ken Hardy says, that he doesn't believe really in altruism. He thinks that most everything we do is really self-serving. And so in that way, we've watched those videos for decades. And my call and ask is also, white people, recognize if you don't care about people besides yourself, also know that you are harming your own children. We're passing on these legacies to our own children. And so in all of that, my hope is that we all generate greater compassion and greater courage to transform our current ways of being and educating children everywhere.
Thank you, Christina. Do you have a contact slide you can put back up with your information on it, with your website? There you go. Thank you. A lot of folks were asking for that information. Pamela says, I love that we're having this conversation. I often wonder, why do some white people hate Blacks so much? It's like, what did we do? The only thing I can think of is it's generational and passed down, because as an African American, I was never taught to hate anyone. As a Christian, we were taught to always love no matter how bad someone treats you. It's our faith in God that will help bring us through. We shall overcome. Thank you for that, Pamela.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the engagement with this topic and this tension and this this recognition that it doesn't make sense, and all of the things we espouse and profess about we're created equal, right, in this nation. All of the ways that vision that we put forward of who we are and who we want to be as like just loving people has often been, justice and freedom loving people has often been very violently untrue in the ways that we've excluded and terrorized communities of color. And so I agree 100%, it doesn't make sense. and yet cycles of oppression and this desire for power over and exploitation of others. The root of that is this, again, this toxic, I would argue, as Bell Hooks said, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy that we ultimately need to come together and work to dismantle.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment. Thank you, Christina. We have an anonymous question. How can a person who sees words and not actions in their organization make their leaders do the real work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would also just acknowledge that, you know, a very real risk of this model is that we just become more eloquent racists, that we just learn to talk and say the right words, but we don't actually like commit to this very deep interpersonal soul transforming work that I think needs to happen alone inside of myself, but also with a community who's going to hold me on that journey. I think journeying toward inner truth can be too daunting to be made alone. And so I think a fair inquiry is about what are the actions that we're committing to and how are we cultivating this alignment and congruence between our words and our thoughts alongside the actions that are either maintaining the status quo or really bravely disrupting it. And so I appreciate the question so much because we can't just talk the talk. And in so many ways, I'm excited to come back to this webinar series in 2 weeks to hear Ms. Cheryl Wilson and her talk on walking the talk, right? So really backing up our aspirational anti-racist values with action and restorative justice.
Yes, thank you, Christina. You talk about, you know, walking the talk and making the change and using the right words. Sarah says, I was taught in college that race is a made-up word, that different races do not truly exist. Is this a white centrist concept? If race is a made-up concept, why do we continue to use the term? Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Absolutely. This idea of the human race in our core shared humanity is so much the vision of what we're fighting for in a spirit of collective liberation. So race, the illusion of race, all of the wonderful documentaries around that, it's a made up construct with very profound and devastating, life-altering, murderous implications. So we can know in our hearts that we are a human species, the human race, and we know that our systems have been built around the ideology and delusion of white supremacy that says white people deserve to be centered as normal, right, and good. And we get to then own other human beings. We get to steal indigenous land because we want it. Those patterns of domination and the violence are very real realities that we must work to fight against, transform, and then ultimately, I think the vision would be absolutely living as equals and traveling the planet as such.
Thank you. Tanya says, as a fellow social worker, my education fell short too. What response or advice do you have for social work educational programs?
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it because there is a woman of color in my life who is very close and dear to my heart, who while going through her MSW program would say to me, gosh, can I get a copy of your book? I really want to like sneak it to my professors. I really want to get this to them so that white professors are also committed to this interpersonal lifelong work and then are working to show up differently in classrooms and to do less harm, right? So much of this is about knowing we will do harm, but we have got to fight to do less harm. She felt so invisible and just unseen and unheard. And so I think absolutely I agree that at institutional levels we need systemic change, and also in this idea of holding all of us accountable for that lifelong growth and not just sort of checking the box of attending an annual cultural competence training. So in a very just one example of maybe the many ways I might respond, this idea, she literally like snuck this book into her professors' mailboxes in the hopes that they might build that community to commit to lifelong introspection so they could show up differently for her.
Thank you. Nabik says, our friend Nabik shared with us, sometimes it is difficult to engage in these discussions as an Anishinaabe person. Even in this discussion, we are mostly invisible. I wish the conversation could expand from not only Black America, but Brown America as well. Thank you, Nabik.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that, for contributing your voice to this conversation. One of our absolute problematic tensions in anti-racism work is focusing too often on a Black-white binary. Certainly that is invisibilizing to other communities of color that are also impacted by the system of white supremacy. Today, we're really focused on working to dismantle. And so certainly my commitment is to say, white folks, we have to look at ourselves because we are hurting the BIPOC community as a whole. And also I can acknowledge that many of my mentors are in fact African-American, and so that representation may show up slightly more visibly here, with really, again, a shared commitment of uprooting the white supremacy that is hurting everyone and disrespecting and violently interacting with Indigenous sovereignty.
Thank you both. We had another question come in here. How do we combat the issue of white women's tears when trying to call in white feminist members of our community?
Oh, I really appreciate this question. And again, I think the context for these conversations matters tremendously, right? So we would likely respond differently in a multiracial space where a white woman is maybe taking the microphone and really centering herself and crying, and we might approach her and say, you know what, can we get the mic back and let's maybe step outside? I'd love to talk with you further. We might interrupt more directly there. And at the same time, I would say in this recovery from white conditioning model in space, the tears are really welcome. Like we, again, in traveling from our heads to our hearts, we have got to feel, we have got to recognize that this is in us and we're passing it to our children. And so again, inviting those tears in a way that is ultimately, again, committed to this lifelong learning journey, and not in those other spaces asking people of color to take care of us. So that's my initial response. I also, if we were together in a group, I'd love to hear from other folks how they've done that well also.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about the 12-step. Was anyone in 12-step recovery consulted when developing this model? And do you also follow the 12 traditions and 12 concepts?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yes, some of our core group members are absolutely in 12-step programs. And I would say that we really embrace the spirit of take what you like and leave the rest. And so there isn't necessarily an exact, translation between the steps, or we haven't sort of confirmed whether the traditions and concepts are fully connected to how we're doing this work. We really have just started with the steps, but are looking forward to building broader coalitions with folks, again, in other chapters on the other coasts, to be really thinking this through, also because many of those core group members are in 12-step programs as well.
Thank you for that. Before we continue, Peter, are you still with us here in Zoom? I know Peter is monitoring our fellow learners who are joining us via the live stream on YouTube. And Peter, if you're with us, are there any questions you can share from those folks?
I am here. We've had about 100 people on for most of the presentation. Not a lot going on in the chat here. We did have one comment from a person who said, I went to Howard University School of Social Work. Perhaps that people of white institutions, I guess she means PWIs, partner with HBCU social work programs, which I'm not sure what that acronym means either. to ensure that they are teaching the Black perspective. I understand that that would be a really good partnership or a good way to consult with other institutions where you could get a bit of perspective, because I think from what you were saying, Christina, and some others, is that, and I know as a faculty member, former faculty member of the School of Social Work, we did not do a good job of teaching, cultural, or looking at our own white biases, our own white supremacy, and the way that we interacted with the clientele, the people that we were trying to teach our students how to work with. We didn't do a good job of it. It's just true. We gave a lot of articles, a lot of lip service, but we never really went deep inside and tried to explore from that position. So I think, this is also something that we can really take a closer look at in terms of further development within curriculum, not just with our school, but with other schools throughout the country.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, thank you for everyone sorry, Christina, HBCUs stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. Thank you for everyone to share. Christina?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think that's a powerful example of, again, like institutional level change, of really thinking differently about the structures of how we collaborate and build bridges between predominantly white institutions and HBCUs. And so thank you so much for sharing that. And my hope, again, at this interpersonal level of organizing, is that folks are increasingly ready and excited and energized about that ideas versus the typical ways we, again, retreat into sort of looking at barriers, because to me that's such a rich synergy, and I hear that Peter's taking notes.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Christina, here's another question that just came in. How do white people move forward with dismantling racism and white supremacy during and after they get done with this 12-step program?
Great question. I mean, I think, like I said in the beginning, this real sliver of, this model represents a sliver of that broad and deep work. And so my hope and commitment is that in these community-based groups that sort of exist in perpetuity beyond any employer who says we're going to do it for 3 months or once a month for the calendar year, my hope is that there would be a space, if only on Zoom, where any white-bodied person coming into new racial consciousness could seek out and find a community of folks who's going to hold them and model for them this lifelong intrapersonal soul work that we can do, and then again support each other in the actions and the new learnings and the seeking knowledge and paying for the knowledge production out there from BIPOC folks. And so for me, just like in AA or Al-Anon or any of the other groups, sometimes folks go for a year, really work hard, and know that they can come back every 6 months for a tune-up, and that there will be folks to hold them. And so this is one way, as Resma says, of building white anti-racist community, saying come together, be connected, have people you can call as accountability partners. And then from that place of ongoing transformation, showing up differently in the world, again, really investing your resources differently, taking action. But truly, I think so much of that is rooted in the importance of human relationships, and us as social workers, that's one of our core values. So the sense of connect and build and keep going versus really isolating, as we often do on our couches, sort of retreating and watching Project Runway.
So here, Christian, is an interesting and I think really important question from someone. It says, my family is very mixed. Many of us look white, and I feel I have lived a life of white privilege. It's an odd place to be situated when you feel the rage of racial injustice against your relations, but you yourself are treated with privilege and just by the virtue of looking white. Have likely somehow participated and or contributed, if not ourselves, our ancestors' white privilege power structure. Could you say something about that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, again, your lived experience and perspective. What comes to mind immediately are just two resources. So the first is, as I mentioned earlier, the Dr. Ken Hardy's privilege and subjugated task model. So he really breaks down what are the tasks of folks with privileged identities in navigating discussions on race. Some of those tasks include do not issue prescriptions on like what people of color need to do, right? And then for people of color, for folks on the subjugated task or in that category, some of those tasks include cease and desist taking care of the privilege, and Ken translates that to say, let white people sit in their poopy pampers. So really, like, if we're going to come together and have these dialogues, there are different ways that we need to show up in the space together. And what I want to offer to folks of mixed race heritage is that that model also, while it looks fixed, it also allows for flexibility. So Ken often encourages folks, well, how would you respond from like your privileged identity in that reaction? If it's, you know, or how would you respond from your subjugated self? What is the work that you feel most called to do in any given moment? And so I think just knowing our motivations is so much a part of this model, like knowing what's going on inside of us and how we're showing up and what work we're doing, what we're avoiding. The second resource I would offer is just, I appreciate so much the Mixed Midwest organization, because in their conference or in their work, they have, even within that identity, have 3 separate caucus groups. So caucus space for folks of mixed heritage who walk in the world as a person of color. They have a space for mixed race folks who walk in the world as white passing, and they have a space for trans racial adoptees. Just knowing that, again, these identities are complex and we have multiple places of belonging and then different work and responsibilities for advancing social justice.
Thank you, Christina. We're nearing the end of our Q&A time, and I want to get in just a couple more quick questions here. Christina Lane asks, how does this program work to avoid the pitfalls of white saviorism and performative allyship?
Yeah, great question. I appreciate that. And again, as a white woman social worker, this notion of rushing in to be the helper is something that's very real, this white saviorism complex that many of us have experienced. I'm just going to read a sentence from our step 1 chapter that says, at minimum, we are shifting the paradigm. We are ceasing to perpetuate ideas that involve white people, pitying people of color, feeling plagued by white guilt to the point of inaction, or perceiving ourselves as heroic in the fight for racial justice. We are instead declaring what we deeply believe to be true. We must work every day to save ourselves, to fight against the ugliness and hate in our world tied up in white supremacist teachings that live in us and around us. So this idea, like this American Indian man had said, this is a group for white people to save ourselves from ourselves. And so positioning this not as, again, this like altruistic, charitable way that we're showing up in the world, but like we have got to do this work inside of our souls for our communities, legacy, and our children and grandchildren. I would add that there's always, of course, a risk involved though, right? There are healthy recovery groups and there are less healthy groups where sort of, despite the structure and the invitation, we can avoid doing the work that we want to do, and we can show up with greater sincerity and commitment to change, or just kind of go through the motions. And so I appreciate the question, because there's really no guarantee that someone couldn't show up and just sort of pat themselves on the back. But in my lived experience, people are showing up and really facing some very raw, real, powerful corners of their own souls. For example, when organization, we had a first step meeting, and one of the therapists just said, yeah, I think dangerous minds played a role in me as a white woman thinking I'm going to come in and work in the inner city. And like, I've never said that out loud, and I need to really look at that. So I guess I would again say that the invitation is there for folks to use if they choose it.
Thank you, Christina. Leslie asks, could you please repeat the organization with the 3 cohorts regarding mixed race?
Yes, I believe it's called Mixed Midwest or Midwest Mixed.
Okay, thank you. I hope you got that, everyone, Leslie. And one final question, Vicky asks, how do white people respond to other white people when they state they don't see color?
I appreciate that. And I'm sure many of us on this call as white-bodied folks at some point in our life believed that that was the right thing to say. So again, I would invite us to really take the spirit of this model and the humility and some sense of wanting to be effective more than wanting to be right. So really approaching this person thinking about how can I effectively call them into a conversation and to ultimately expand understandings and grow together. Again, we're both on that spectrum. We all have work to do. So I think there's this lovely tool that one of our members shares of like felt, found, feel. I once felt that way too. Then I found out that I don't see color is in many ways invalidating to folks. Color isn't the problem. It's our inability to celebrate and recognize those differences. And so now I feel committed to acknowledging racial differences and to also then acknowledging the racial injustices that are happening to our BIPOC siblings. And I'd love to talk with you about that. Can we go grab a bite?
Thank you so much, Christina. I say to please see color and see its beauty. Thank you, Kim. That is a beautiful sentiment to end today's presentation with.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Center for Practice Transformation, the Continuing Education Series, and the School of Social Work, we'd like to thank you all for taking your time, sharing your lived experiences, your heartfelt feelings. And we'd like to extend an extra special thanks to Christina Combs, today's presenter, for kicking off this amazing three-part series.
Thank you so much for the honor of being here and again sharing this one resource amid infinite resources. And if I could, I'd just love to leave us with this quote from the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward.
Thank you, Christina. I know we're all moving forward, committed to anti-racism. Thank you all, and we hope you can join us next week and the following week for the next two parts in this series.